Whenever we think about the role that women played in history, in moving history forward, in many instances, many of us are left without much to say. Not because women were absent from the major incidents of the past and the series of struggles, victories, and defeats, defeats that have brought us to where we are today, but because it's a history that we don't hear about. Women have been key leaders, movers, and fighters from the early labor struggles that won the 8-hour workday and ended child labor, to the struggles that fought for the end of war and the occupation in the 60s, to the direct struggle for the emancipation of women in the form of birth control, abortion, and equal rights. There's a rich history of women's struggle in the U.S. Yeah, this is sort of weird. Okay, that's good. There's a rich history of women's struggle in the U.S. that we can only skim the surface of with this talk, but hopefully this will inspire everyone here in this room to learn more about the extraordinary feats that women have been accomplishing for centuries up till now. An important area of American history is the history of labor and labor relations in the U.S. The early 1900s was an explosive time in the American labor movement. It was the era of the 18-hour workday, dangerous working conditions, meager wages for women, and child labor. Out of these conditions emerged the fighting, militant movement of fed-up workers, with thousands of women within its ranks who could no longer suffer these ills and sit down quietly. Women played key roles in workers' rights movements worldwide for over a century. Images from strikes and protests drive home women's long-standing commitment to equal pay, fair working wages, conditions, and the right to form unions. Even though the employment partially eased the financial strain on the family, women workers were forced to endure 12 to 14-hour workdays, many times with no breaks and in poor and dangerous working conditions. Women and children, especially of immigrant backgrounds, became an important source of cheap labor for factory owners to exploit. At the workplace and elsewhere, they faced sexual harassment and had little chance to advance. At the same time, women were still banned from participating in the electoral process. In the early 1900s, labor activists and women began to agitate more forcefully for humane working conditions and for women's suffrage. They even declared the first National Women's Day in the U.S. in 1909. But during this time of increased women's struggle, women still face universal exclusion from unions. In response, women intensified their organizing efforts. They put on union organizing drives and assembled women's committees that struggled for workers' rights, while highlighting the specific discrimination and oppression that they faced in the workplace as women. One of the major organizations that emerged out of this pushback against the status quo of labor inequality and discrimination was the Women's Trade Union League. The WTLU, along with masses of women, workers, and labor organizations, came together during the uprising of the 20,000, which was the New York City and Philadelphia shirtwaist workers' strike. This organization of women workers, along with male allies and non-union women and workers, supported the massive fight-back effort by providing a headquarters for the strike, raising money for relief funds, soup kitchens, and bail for picketers, providing the witnesses and legal defense for arrested picketers, and also joining the strikers on the picket line and organizing mass meetings and marches to publicize the shirtwaist workers' demands and the sweatshop conditions that they were all working in. Garment factory workers in New York City and elsewhere began to demand for higher wages, shorter hours, safer conditions, and unionization. The workers at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory did not stay behind in this fight. They were overwhelmingly immigrant women from ages 12 to 23. They worked 60 to 72 hour work weeks for 13 cents an hour, an egregiously low wage for even that time. A mass strike took place in the factory in 1909, lasting 14 weeks. The strike was provoked by a small walkout by 1/4 of the Triangle factory workers. As news of the walkout spread, workers called for a strike throughout the entire industry. Over 20,000 people participated in the strike in the first 2 days. Those workers, primarily immigrants and mostly women, defied the preconceptions of more conservative labor leaders who thought that immigrant women could not be organized, that immigrants and women could not be organized. Their slogan, we'd rather starve quick than starve slow, summed up in depth their bitterness against the sweatshops in which they worked. The struggle that these women waged in the streets was what forced the bosses to concede their demands for higher pay and shorter work hours. It would take the Triangle workers 11 weeks to finally win these two demands in 1910. Factory owners refused to submit to a union, without which the women workers found it hard to continue to improve the conditions at the Triangle factory. A fire broke out at the Triangle factory 2 years later in March 1911. The factory's front doors were kept locked at all times by the factory owners as a measure to prevent theft and kept workers from taking unauthorized breaks. The owners only allowed workers to access the back doors, and even then workers would exit one by one so each of their bags to be checked. This triangle fire took the lives of over 146 young women in New York City's largest workplace accident ever. The owners, Harris and Blank, were tried for manslaughter but were acquitted. The public outcry forced state lawmakers to enact safety and labor laws, making New York State a state with one of the most comprehensive safety regulations in the country. But alongside the valiant efforts that women made to end abuse against women in the labor force, women have also been active fighters in the struggle against racism and for civil rights. During the Montgomery bus boycotts, women played vital leadership roles in mobilizing the local black community against the discriminatory practices of the city's transit system on the heels of the 1953 Supreme Court ruling proclaiming that separate but equal schools were unconstitutional. In Montgomery, Alabama, the bus boycott, which is usually credited with giving birth to the civil rights movement, was organized in large part by the efforts of women. The Women's Political Council, founded in 1946 by a group of African-American women college professors at Alabama State College, and a group that also claimed membership of over 300 women, had been debating for years whether or not a bus boycott in response to racist Jim Crow policies via the city's transportation services would be successful. The group had been collecting complaints against the Montgomery City bus lines as far back as 1953. The WPC had frequently discussed the idea of calling a boycott, but people felt the timing was not right. That began to change beginning on March 2nd, 1955, when a 15-year-old black student named Claudette Colvin rode the bus. Claudette Colvin did not take a seat reserved for whites. She sat down 2 rows from the back of the bus. But on this particular day, the bus was so crowded that the bus driver asked her to give up her front seat to a white person. When she refused to give up her seat, the bus driver radioed ahead to the police, who handcuffed the outspoken student and physically dragged her off the bus and to jail. She was charged with misconduct, resisting arrest, and violating the city's segregation laws. News of the arrest spread throughout the black community. The idea of initiating a boycott was reopened, and the WPC, who had already drawn up a leaflet to announce the boycott, only the day and time had to be added. In the meantime, financial more support for Claudette Colvin started pouring in from all over the country. She was, however, found guilty of all the charges and released on probation. Another young woman, Mary Louise Smith, was arrested in October 1955 and found guilty on similar charges. The straw that broke the camel's back for the black community came on December 1st, 1955, when Rosa Parks was arrested on the same charges. The WPC went into action. Its members took to the streets to reproduce and distribute 50,000 flyers that read, "The Women's Political Council will not wait for Mrs. Parks' consent to call for a boycott of city buses." And on December 2nd, 1955, the women of Montgomery will call for a boycott to take place on December 5th. Mass meetings organized by women were held in black churches to galvanize the black community into action. This opened the floodgates for community organizing all over the South, where Jim Crow segregation was the most severe. This promulgated political activity among young women, including young women all over the country. The sit-in strikes and lunch counter occupations that followed to end segregation and defeat Jim Crow apartheid included the heavy participation of women from the organizing stages to the actual sit-in protests, where in countless cases young black women were arrested for participating in the militant actions.